Welcome to Mystery at 221B, where Sherlock Holmes' secrets come to life.
In the fog-shrouded halls of Marwood Manor, a scream pierces the night, and a loyal housekeeper lies dead, a dagger in her heart. Who among the elegant guests, each hiding secrets of greed, betrayal and revenge, wields the hand of a killer? Join Sherlock Holmes, the brilliant Belgian detective, as he unravels a web of lies, from a cryptic note to a mysterious shadow, in a closed-circle mystery where every clue counts. Will the truth emerge before the shadows claim another life? Dive into Sherlock Holmes and the Shadow over Baker Street, a tale of suspense, deception, and genius that keeps you guessing until the final shocking reveal. Chapter 1. The Gathering at Marwood Manor. In the late autumn of 1895, when the leaves of Kent had turned to a sombre palette of russet and gold, Captain Arthur Hastings found himself summoned to Marwood Manor, a grand but aging estate nestled in the rolling countryside. The invitation had come from Sir Reginald Marwood, a retired diplomat of some repute, whose acquaintance Hastings had made during a brief but memorable sojourn in Brussels. The letter, penned in Sir Reginald's meticulous hand, spoke of a weekend gathering to discuss matters of delicate importance, though it was coyly devoid of specifics. Hastings, ever susceptible to the lure of intrigue, accepted with alacrity, sensing the faint perfume of mystery in the air. Marwood Manor stood as a monument to faded opulence, its ivy-clad walls and mullioned windows exuding an air of melancholy grandeur. As Hastings' carriage rattled up the gravel drive, the evening mist curled around the estate like a spectral shroud, softening the edges of the ancient oaks that lined the approach. The manor's silhouette loomed against the twilight sky, its chimneys piercing the heavens like the masts of a ship adrift in a sea of fog. Hastings, ever the romantic, felt a shiver of anticipation, though whether it was born of the chill air or the promise of secrets, he could not say. He was greeted at the door by a butler of impeccable bearing, whose name, Mr. Grayson, was delivered with the gravity of a royal proclamation. The hall into which Hastings was ushered was a cavernous space, its walls adorned with portraits of Marwood's past, their eyes seeming to follow him with silent judgment. A fire roared in the immense hearth, casting flickering shadows that danced across the polished oak floor. Sir Reginald himself appeared moments later, a tall, lean figure with a face lined by years of diplomatic maneuvering, his eyes sharp and searching despite the warmth of his greeting. "My dear Captain Hastings," said Sir Reginald, clasping his hand, "I am delighted you could join us. You are, I trust, prepared for a weekend of stimulating company." "Indeed, Sir Reginald," replied Hastings, his military bearing softened by a smile. "Though I confess, your letter was
Reginald's smile was enigmatic.
All in good time, my friend. For now, allow me to introduce you to our other guests."
The drawing room, to which they repaired, was a study in contrasts, opulent yet austere, warm yet shadowed. A long mahogany table bore a silver tea service, its gleam catching the light of a chandelier that hung like a constellation above. The assembled company was small but varied, each guest exuding an air of guarded civility that hinted at hidden currents beneath their polished exteriors. First was Lady Eleanor Marwood, Sir Reginald's younger sister, a woman of striking beauty whose auburn hair and emerald eyes belied the strain evident in her taut posture. She greeted Hastings with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, her fingers toying nervously with a pearl necklace. Beside her sat Dr. Julian Carver, a physician of middle years, whose spectacles and reserved demeanour suggested a man more comfortable with books than people. His handshake was firm but brief, as though he wished to retreat into his thoughts. Next was Miss Clara Wentworth, a young heiress whose fortune, it was whispered, derived from her late father's ventures in the East Indies. Her delicate features and soft voice were offset by a keen intelligence that flickered in her gaze, and Hastings found himself intrigued by the quiet intensity she exuded. Opposite her lounged Mr. Victor Langston, a barrister with a reputation for ruthless advocacy in the courts of London. His sharp wit and easy charm were tempered by a certain hardness in his eyes, as though he weighed every word for its potential to wound or defend. Finally, there was Mrs. Beatrice Harrow, a widow of indeterminate age whose black mourning dress seemed to absorb the light around her. Her face, though handsome, was marked by a profound sadness, and her conversation was punctuated by long, thoughtful silences. Hastings noted the way her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup, a detail that did not escape his soldier's eye. The conversation at first was the sort expected at such gatherings, polite inquiries into health, the weather, and the state of the nation. Yet beneath the surface, Hastings sensed a tension, like the taut strings of a violin awaiting the bow. Sir Reginald presided with the ease of a seasoned host, but his eyes darted frequently to the door, as though expecting another arrival. Lady Eleanor spoke little, her attention fixed on the fire, while Miss Wentworth's attempts at levity were met with strained smiles. Dr. Carver, meanwhile, seemed preoccupied with a small notebook in which he occasionally scribbled, his pen moving with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. It was nearing 8 o'clock when the atmosphere shifted. The butler, Grayson, entered with a silver tray bearing a decanter of port and glasses, his face as impassive as ever. Yet as he poured, a faint tremor in his hand caused a single drop to spill onto the pristine tablecloth, a
crimson stain that seemed to hold the room's attention for a moment too long. Sir Reginald cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Ha, I trust," he said, addressing the company, "that you have all found the evening agreeable thus far. But I must confess, our gathering has a purpose beyond mere sociability. There is a matter, a delicate matter, that requires our collective attention." The room grew still, the crackle of the fire the only sound. Hastings felt his pulse quicken, his instincts honed by years of service alerting him to the gravity of the moment. Before Sir Reginald could elaborate, however, a piercing scream rent the air, echoing from somewhere deep within the manor. The guests froze, their faces a gallery of shock and suspicion. Lady Eleanor's hand flew to her throat, Miss Wentworth's teacup clattered to the floor, and Mrs. Harrow's eyes widened in terror. Sir Reginald rose, his face pale but composed. "Grayson, see to it at once," he commanded. The butler nodded and departed with a swiftness that belied his years. The guests exchanged glances, each searching for answers in the other's expressions. Hastings, his mind racing, recalled the layout of the manor from his arrival, the winding corridors, the shadowed staircases, the myriad rooms that could conceal any number of secrets. Minutes later, Grayson returned, his face ashen. "Sir Reginald," he said, his voice low but steady, "it is Miss Margaret, the housekeeper. She has been found, dead, in the library." A collective gasp rose from the table. Lady Eleanor swayed, clutching the arm of her chair, while Dr. Carver's notebook fell forgotten to the floor. Mr. Langston's jaw tightened, and Miss Wentworth's eyes narrowed, as though calculating the implications. Mrs. Harrow, alone, remained silent, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the room. Sir Reginald's voice cut through the chaos. "We must remain calm. Captain Hastings, you have experience in such matters. Will you accompany me to the library?" Hastings nodded, his mind already turning to the task ahead. As they left the drawing room, he could not shake the feeling that the scream had been merely the opening note of a far darker symphony. Marwood Manor, with its ancient walls and hidden corners, was no longer a mere backdrop, but a stage for a drama of deception and death. And somewhere, in the shadows, a murderer watched and waited. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The library of Marwood Manor was a chamber of solemn grandeur, its walls lined with towering shelves that groaned under the weight of countless volumes. The air was heavy with the scent of aged leather and polished wood, and a single chandelier cast a dim, golden glow over the scene.
Yet, as Captain Arthur Hastings stepped into the room behind Sir Reginald Marwood, it was not the elegance of the library that seized his attention.
Sprawled across a Persian rug, her body unnaturally still. Her face, frozen in a rictus of terror, stared blankly at the ceiling, her grey hair loosened from its usual severe bun. A crimson stain bloomed across the bodice of her black dress, and a small ornate dagger protruded from her chest, its silver handle glinting in the flickering light. The scene was as precise as it was grotesque, as though the murderer had staged it with an artist's care. Sir Reginald, his face pale but resolute, knelt briefly beside the body, his fingers hovering over the dagger before he withdrew them, as though burned by the sight. "Good God, Hastings," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who could have done such a thing?" Hastings, his soldier's instincts overriding his shock, surveyed the room with a practiced eye. The library was vast, its high windows shrouded in heavy velvet curtains that blocked the moonlight. A mahogany desk stood near one wall, its surface cluttered with papers, an inkstand, and a single candlestick, its wax still warm and pliable. A fireplace, cold and unlit, yawned at the far end, its mantel adorned with a brass clock that ticked with relentless precision. 8:17 p.m. Two armchairs flanked a low table, one bearing a half-empty glass of sherry, its amber contents catching the chandelier's light. A single book lay open on the floor near Miss Margaret's outstretched hand, its pages splayed as though dropped in haste. "Sir Reginald," Hastings said, his tone steady despite the grim scene. "We must disturb nothing until the authorities arrive. But I would suggest sending for Sherlock Holmes at once. This is no ordinary crime." Sir Reginald nodded, his eyes still fixed on the housekeeper's body. "Yes, of course, Holmes. I shall telegraph him immediately. Grayson," he called, and the butler appeared in the doorway, his composure strained but intact. "Send a wire to London. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street, urgently request his presence." As Grayson departed, Hastings knelt beside the body, careful not to touch anything. The dagger was an unusual piece, its handle engraved with intricate floral patterns, suggesting it was more ornamental than practical. The wound was clean, precise, indicating a single forceful thrust. Miss Margaret's right hand was clenched, as though she had grasped at something in her final moments, and a faint smudge of ink stained her fingers. Hastings noted the book on the floor, a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets, open to Sonnet 18, its pages unmarred, save for a faint crease at the corner. The door creaked, and Dr. Julian Carver entered, his medical bag in hand. "I came doing." Hastings glanced at the doctor, noting the slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted his spectacles. "Can you estimate the time of death more precisely, Dr. Carver?" Carver frowned, his eyes narrowing as he studied the body. "Between 7 and 8 p.m., I'd wager. The blood is still fresh, and rigor has not yet set in. I'll need to examine her further, but the police will want the scene preserved." Hastings nodded, his mind cataloguing the details. The scream had come at approximately 8 p.m., meaning the murder had occurred shortly before. The guests had been in the drawing room at the time, save for Grayson, who had been serving port. Yet the manor's labyrinthine corridors offered ample opportunity for someone to slip away unnoticed. He made a mental note to confirm each guest's whereabouts at the critical moment. Sir Reginald, who had been pacing near the desk, paused and turned to Hastings. "Miss Margaret was with us for 20 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She was more than a housekeeper, she was family. Why would anyone do this?" Before Hastings could respond, Lady Eleanor, appeared in the doorway, her face pale as alabaster. "Reginald, is it true?" she whispered, her eyes darting to the body before she averted them, clutching the doorframe for support. "Oh, Margaret, how could this happen?"
"Eleanor, please," Sir Reginald said, crossing to her side. "You mustn't see this. Return to the drawing room. I'll join you shortly." But Lady Eleanor shook her head, her gaze hardening.
"No, Reginald. I want to know what happened. She was my friend too."
Hastings observed the exchange, noting the tension between the siblings. Lady Eleanor's grief seemed genuine, yet there was a defiance in her posture that suggested more than simple sorrow. He filed the observation away, his thoughts turning to the other guests. Miss Wentworth, Mr. Langston, and Mrs. Harrow remained in the drawing room, presumably under Grayson's watchful eye. Each would need to be questioned, their alibis scrutinized. As Dr. Carver covered Miss Margaret's body with a cloth from his bag, Hastings stepped toward the desk, his eyes drawn to the papers scattered across its surface. Most were mundane, household accounts, letters from tenants. But one caught his attention, a half-finished note in Miss Margaret's precise handwriting, addressed to Sir Reginald. It read, "I must speak with you privately. There is something you must know about—" The sentence broke off abruptly, the pen lying beside it as though dropped mid-thought. "Sir Reginald," Hastings said, gesturing to the note, "did Miss Margaret mention anything to you about a pressing matter?" Sir Reginald frowned, peering at the paper. "No, nothing. She was her usual self this morning, efficient, reserved. If she had something—"
Margaret had uncovered something significant, something worth killing to keep hidden. He glanced at the clock. 8:25 p.m. The local police would arrive soon, but their methods were often crude, their conclusions hasty. Sherlock Holmes, with his unparalleled genius for deduction, was the only man capable of unraveling this tangle of motives and secrets. As Sir Reginald and Lady Eleanor withdrew to comfort the other guests, Hastings lingered in the library, his gaze sweeping the room once more. The sherry glass, the open book, the ink-stained fingers, the ornate dagger, all were pieces of a puzzle that refused to cohere. Yet, he knew that somewhere in these details lay the truth, waiting to be uncovered by the keen mind of Sherlock Holmes. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows as though the manor itself were protesting the violence within its walls. Hastings felt a chill that had little to do with the autumn night. Marwood Manor was no longer a place of refuge, but a labyrinth of suspicion, where every shadow concealed a potential threat. And as he stood alone in the silent library, he could not shake the feeling that the murderer was closer than any of them dared to imagine. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Sherlock Holmes. The morning following the grim discovery in Marwood Manor's library broke with a heavy fog that clung to the Kentish countryside like a mourner's veil. Captain Arthur Hastings stood at the window of the manor's morning room, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the drive for any sign of movement. The local police had arrived the previous night, led by a gruff Inspector Lestrade, whose methodical but uninspired approach had left the scene largely undisturbed. Lestrade had sealed the library, posted a constable at the door, and taken cursory statements from the guests before retiring to the village inn, promising to return with reinforcements. Hastings, however, placed little faith in the inspector's plotting methods. His hopes rested on a far keener mind. At precisely 10 o'clock, the crunch of gravel announced the arrival of a hansom cab, its black silhouette emerging from the mist like a specter. The door swung open, and out stepped Sherlock Holmes, his compact figure clad in a neatly pressed suit, his eyes gleaming with the quiet intensity that Hastings knew so well. His mustache was impeccably trimmed, his movements precise, almost feline, as he surveyed the manor with a single sweeping glance. Beside him stood Dr. John Watson, ever the loyal companion, his face a mixture of concern and curiosity as he adjusted his hat against the damp air. "Hastings, mon ami," Holmes called, his Belgian accent lending a musical lilt to his words as he ascended the steps. "You have summoned me to a most intriguing stage, have you not? A murder in a manor, a circle of suspects, and a fog to shroud the truth. C'est magnifique." Hastings clasped Holmes' hand warmly, relief flooding through him. "Holmes, I'm
Glad you come. It's a devilish business. The housekeeper, Miss Margaret, stabbed in the library. And not a soul in the house without some shadow of motive. Watson, ever practical, frowned. Stabbed, you say? Any witnesses? Signs of a struggle? None that we found, Hastings replied, leading them into the hall. The scene is untouched, save for the doctor's examination. The police are involved, but you know how Lestrade is, competent but lacking your finesse. Holmes' lips twitched in a faint smile. Finesse, Hastings, is merely the application of order and method to the chaos of human behavior. Now, let us see this library of yours. The stage is set, and I'm eager to read its script. The library, still sealed by Lestrade's orders, was opened at Holmes' insistence, the constable stepping aside with a mixture of awe and irritation. The room was much as Hastings had left it, Miss Margaret's body now covered with a sheet, the dagger removed by Dr. Carver for examination but replaced with a marker for accuracy. The sherry glass, the open book, the scattered papers on the desk, all remained as silent witnesses to the crime. Holmes moved with the precision of a watchmaker, his eyes darting from one detail to another. He knelt beside the body, lifting the sheet to study Miss Margaret's face, his fingers tracing the air above her clenched hand. "The expression of terror," he murmured, "is not merely the result of pain, but of recognition. She knew her killer, Hastings, and see here, the ink on her fingers." She was writing, perhaps, when interrupted. He rose and crossed to the desk, his gaze falling on the half-finished note Hastings had discovered. "There is something you must know about," he read aloud, his brow furrowing. "A secret, then? One worth killing to protect. But whose secret?" He turned to the open book of Shakespeare's sonnets, his fingers brushing the creased page. Sonnet 18. A curious choice. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? A romantic gesture or a deliberate clue? Watson, examining the sherry glass, sniffed its contents cautiously. "No odor of poison, but I'll have it tested. The glass is half empty, suggesting she was drinking when attacked. No signs of a struggle, though. Odd for a stabbing." "Precisement," Holmes said, his eyes gleaming. "The absence of struggle suggests trust. She allowed her killer to approach closely, perhaps even to stand over her. The dagger is ornamental, not a weapon one carries casually. It was taken from this very room, perhaps?" He scanned the shelves, pausing at a small display case near the fireplace, its glass door ajar. Inside, a velvet cushion bore the imprint of a missing object, its shape matching the dagger's. "A family heirloom, perhaps," Hastings suggested, "so Reginald might know its origin." Holmes nodded, his mind clearly racing. "To meet these players in our little drama. Their faces, their gestures, their lies, these will tell us more than any dagger." In the drawing room, the guests were assembled, their faces a study in strained civility. Sir Reginald stood by the window, his posture rigid, while Lady Eleanor sat pale and silent, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Dr. Carver scribbled in his notebook, his spectacles reflecting the firelight, while Miss Clara Wentworth sipped tea with an air of forced calm. Mr. Victor Langston leaned against the mantel, his sharp eyes tracking Holmes' every move, and Mrs. Beatrice Harrow sat apart, her mourning dress blending with the shadows. Holmes entered with a bow, his manner courteous but commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth as polished oak, "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my friend Dr. Watson. I have been engaged to investigate the tragic death of Miss Margaret. I assure you, the truth will be uncovered, for no detail escapes the scrutiny of order and method." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Lady Eleanor's fingers tightened on her necklace. Dr. Carver's pen paused mid-stroke, and Mr. Langston's smile was a touch too sharp. Miss Wentworth met Holmes' gaze with a flicker of curiosity, while Mrs. Harrow's eyes remained fixed on the floor, her silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. "May I ask," Holmes continued, pacing slowly before the group, "where each of you was between 7 and 8 o'clock last evening when the crime occurred?" Sir Reginald spoke first, his voice steady. "I was in this very room, hosting our guests. Grayson can confirm it." "Indeed, sir," the butler said from the doorway. "I was serving port at the time." Lady Eleanor nodded faintly. "I was here as well, though I stepped out briefly to fetch my shawl from the morning room. I returned before the scream." Dr. Carver cleared his throat. "I was here discussing a medical journal with Miss Wentworth. We were all together when we heard the cry." Miss Wentworth's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes, though I believe Mr. Langston had excused himself to the smoking room just before." Langston's smile did not waver. "A brief respite, Miss Wentworth. I was alone, I'm afraid, but I returned the moment I heard the commotion." Mrs. Harrow's voice was barely audible. "I was here, by the fire. I don't recall anything unusual." Holmes' gaze lingered on each face, as though reading the lines of a hidden script. "Mercy," he said at last. "Your accounts are most illuminating. I shall examine the library further, but I may call upon you again. The truth, mes amis, is like a mosaic." Quiet excitement. The scream, Hastings, is but one note in a symphony of deception. The dagger, the note, the sherry glass, these are the true instruments, and I, Sherlock Holmes, shall conduct them until the melody of truth is revealed. With that, he turned back to the library, his mind already piecing together the fragments of a puzzle that grew more intricate with every step. Hastings followed, his heart pounding with the certainty that Marwood Manor held secrets far darker than the fog that shrouded it. Chapter 4. The questions begin. The fog that cloaked Marwood Manor had thickened by midday, wrapping the estate in a muffling silence that seemed to amplify the tension within its walls. In the drawing room, where the guests had reconvened after a somber luncheon, Sherlock Holmes stood before the great fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes scanning the assembled company with the precision of a jeweler inspecting a flawed gem. Captain Arthur Hastings, seated near the window, watched his friend with a mixture of admiration and anticipation, knowing that beneath Holmes's calm exterior lay a mind that was already unraveling the threads of the mystery. The guests, though outwardly composed, betrayed their unease in subtle ways. Lady Eleanor's fingers twisted a lace handkerchief into knots. Dr. Julian Carver's spectacles slipped down his nose as he scribbled furiously in his notebook, and Mr. Victor Langston's sharp smile flickered like a candle in a draught. Miss Clara Wentworth sat with poised elegance, her eyes darting to Holmes as though measuring his intent, while Mrs. Beatrice Harrow remained a silent shadow, her morning dress blending with the dark upholstery of her chair. Sir Reginald Marwood, standing by the window, seemed to age with every passing hour, his diplomatic poise fraying at the edges. "Mes amis," Holmes began, his voice smooth and measured. "The tragedy of Miss Margaret's death demands clarity, and clarity demands questions. I shall ask each of you to recount your movements and observations from last evening, not merely to confirm your alibis, but to illuminate the small details that so often betray the truth. The human mind is a curious thing. It sees, yet does not always comprehend what it sees. He turned first to Sir Reginald, his gaze piercing but polite. Sir Reginald, you were the host of this gathering. Tell me, what was the purpose of this weekend? And did Miss Margaret give any indication of distress or urgency in the days prior? Sir Reginald cleared his throat, his hands clasped tightly behind him. The gathering was intended as a reunion of sorts. Old friends, trusted acquaintances, brought together to discuss a matter of family significance. As for Margaret, she was her usual self, efficient, discreet. If she was troubled, she gave no sign.
Hastings was vague. Was this matter connected to Miss Margaret in any way? Sir Reginald hesitated, his jaw tightening. Not directly, no. It concerned a private family affair, a legacy, if you will. Margaret was not involved, though as housekeeper, she was privy to much of the manor's business. Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable, and turned to Lady Eleanor. Madam, you mentioned stepping out to fetch your shawl. At what time did you leave the drawing room, and did you see or hear anything unusual in the corridor? Lady Eleanor's eyes flickered to her brother before she answered. It was shortly after 7, I believe. The corridor was quiet, save for the usual creaks of this old house. I saw no one, though I thought I heard a door close somewhere upstairs. I assumed it was Grayson or one of the maids. Interesting, Holmes murmured, his fingers brushing his mustache. And the shawl, where precisely did you retrieve it? From the morning room, she replied, her voice steady but her fingers tightening on the handkerchief. It was draped over a chair. I was gone only a few minutes. Holmes inclined his head and moved to Dr. Carver, who adjusted his spectacles nervously. Doctor, you were discussing a medical journal with Miss Wentworth. Did you remain in the drawing room throughout the evening, or did you perhaps step away? Carver's pen paused, a faint flush rising to his cheeks. I was here, Mr. Holmes, save for a brief moment to fetch my notebook from my room. I returned well before the scream. Miss Wentworth can confirm we were deep in conversation about the latest advances in toxicology. Miss Wentworth nodded, her smile faint but composed. Indeed, we were. Dr. Carver is most knowledgeable. I found his insights quite absorbing. Holmes's gaze lingered on her, as though catching a note of irony in her tone. Mademoiselle Wentworth, you are an observant woman, I think. Did you notice anything, any gesture, any glance that struck you as out of place? Miss Wentworth tilted her head, her eyes meeting his with a spark of challenge. The room was full of polite masks, Mr. Holmes, but I did notice Mrs. Harrow seemed unusually withdrawn, even for one in mourning, and Mr. Langston, well, he has a way of watching everyone as though he's waiting for a misstep. Langston's laugh was sharp, cutting through the tension. A barrister's habit, Miss Wentworth. Observation is my trade. As for my movements, I've already said I was in the smoking room. Alone, unfortunately. But I assure you, I heard nothing until that dreadful scream. Holmes turned to Mrs. Harrow, his voice softening. Madam Harrow, your silence speaks loudly. What did you see or hear, however small, that might aid us? Mrs. Harrow's eyes lifted slowly, her voice barely audible. I was by the fire, lost in my thoughts. I recall a shadow, perhaps, moving past the window.
And I thought it was the wind stirring the curtains. Holmes' expression remained impassive, but Hastings, who knew his friend's methods, saw the faint gleam in his eyes that signaled a detail of interest. A shadow, Holmes repeated, most curious. And you, Grayson, he said, turning to the butler, who stood rigidly by the door. You were serving port. Did you see Miss Margaret at any point that evening? Grayson's face was a mask of professionalism, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of grief. I saw her at 6:30, sir, when she brought the sherry to the library. She seemed preoccupied, perhaps, but said nothing of note. I was in the pantry preparing the port when the scream came. Holmes nodded, pacing slowly before the group. Each of you has painted a picture, yet the canvas remains incomplete. The library. It is the heart of this mystery. The dagger, the note, the sherry glass, these are not mere props, but signposts to the truth. I shall return there now, but I ask you to remain in the manor. The answers, mes amis, are closer than you think. As the guests dispersed, their faces a mixture of relief and suspicion, Hastings followed Holmes back to the library. What do you make of their stories, Holmes? They all claim to have been accounted for, yet someone slipped away to commit the deed. Holmes's smile was faint but knowing. Their alibis, Hastings, are like a house of cards, plausible until one examines the foundation. Lady Eleanor's shawl, Dr. Carver's notebook, Mr. Langston's solitude, each is a thread that may unravel with the right tug. And Mrs. Harrow's shadow, that is a detail most intriguing. But come, let us revisit the scene. The library holds secrets yet to be uncovered. In the library, Holmes moved with renewed purpose, his eyes scanning the room with surgical precision. He paused at the fireplace, running his fingers along the mantel, then stopped abruptly at the display case where the dagger had rested. The case was ajar, he murmured, yet no fingerprints mar its surface. The killer was careful, or perhaps familiar with the household's routines. He turned to the desk, examining the papers once more. The half-finished note to Sir Reginald lay where they had left it, its broken sentence a silent accusation. Holmes lifted it carefully, holding it to the light. The ink is fresh, the pen dropped in haste. Miss Margaret was writing this when she was interrupted. But why here, in the library, and not in her own quarters? Watson, who had been examining the sherry glass, looked up. Perhaps she was meeting someone. The glass suggests she was at ease, at least initially. Précisément, Holmes said, his eyes gleaming. She trusted her killer, and that trust was her undoing. But the note, the dagger, the shadow, these are the keys. We must find it how they whirl of calculations. Hastings felt the weight of the manor's secrets pressing in, each detail a step closer to the truth or deeper into the labyrinth of deceit. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The afternoon light struggled through the fog, casting a pallid glow over Marwood Manor as Sherlock Holmes, Captain Arthur Hastings, and Dr. John Watson reconvened in the library. The room, still sealed save for their investigations, seemed to pulse with the weight of its secrets, the air thick with the lingering scent of sherry and tragedy. Holmes, his eyes alight with the fervor of deduction, paced before the desk, his fingers steepled as he sifted through the testimonies of the morning's interviews. Hastings, seated in one of the armchairs, felt the tension of the case tightening like a noose, while Watson, ever methodical, reviewed his notes on the medical examination of Miss Margaret's body. The local police, under Inspector Lestrade's direction, had returned with a renewed sense of purpose, their heavy boots echoing through the manor's corridors. Lestrade, a man of bulldog tenacity but limited imagination, had fixated on a theory that seemed to Hastings both plausible and perilously premature. The inspector's attention had settled on Grayson, the butler, whose access to every corner of the manor and brief absence from the drawing room made him an obvious suspect. Lestrade's men had questioned Grayson extensively, noting his proximity to the library when fetching the port and his intimate knowledge of the dagger's display case. "Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said, entering the library with a swagger that belied his uncertainty. "I've seen cases like this before. The butler's always got his hands in everything. Knows the house, knows the routines. Grayson's story about being in the pantry doesn't hold water. No witnesses, and that dagger was right there for him to grab." Holmes' lips curved in a faint, indulgent smile. "Inspector, your enthusiasm for simplicity is commendable, but the truth is rarely so obliging. Grayson's role as butler gives him opportunity, but opportunity is not motive. What reason would a loyal servant of 20 years have to murder his employer's housekeeper? Lestrade bristled, adjusting his hat. Loyalty's a fine mask, Mr. Holmes. Maybe she caught him pilfering or they had a falling out. Servants' quarrels can turn nasty. Holmes raised an eyebrow, his gaze drifting to the display case. A quarrel that ends with an ornamental dagger plunged with surgical precision? None, Inspector. This was no crime of passion. The killer planned, observed, and struck with deliberation. But let us humor your theory. Hastings, fetch Grayson, s'il vous plaît. Hastings complied, finding the butler in the servants' hall, his face drawn but composed. Grayson followed without protest, his posture rigid as he faced Holmes and Lestrade in the library. The other guests, confined to
This case of actual description, Stanley. These alls of the hers, the murder dark and Bredums. Holmes' heads. It is little that appeared, stoppé. And this Margaret, you saw her at 6:30 delivering sherry to the library. Did she seem agitated, distracted, perhaps fearful? Grayson hesitated, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. She was quieter than usual, sir. Not fearful, but preoccupied. She mentioned needing to speak with Sir Reginald later, but nothing more. Holmes' eyes gleamed. Most interesting. And the dagger? Had you ever handled it, perhaps to clean the display case? Never, sir. Grayson replied firmly. It was Miss Margaret's duty to maintain the library's artifacts. I rarely entered unless summoned. Lestrade snorted. Convenient, that. You're telling me you never touched a thing in this room, yet you were fetching port right nearby. Grayson's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. My duties are precise, Inspector. I serve where I am needed, not where I'm not. Holmes raised a hand, silencing Lestrade's retort. Merci, you may return to your duties, but remain in the manor. As the butler departed, Holmes turned to Lestrade with a wry smile. You see, Inspector, the butler is a tempting target, but his hands are too clean, literally and figuratively. The absence of fingerprints on the display case suggests a killer who took precautions, not a servant caught in a moment of rage. Lestrade grumbled but made no further argument, retreating to confer with his men. Watson, who had been silent, looked up from his notes. Holmes, if not Grayson, then who? The alibis are tight and the timing is devilishly narrow. The screen came at 8, and everyone claims to have been in the drawing room or nearby. Holmes' eyes sparkled with quiet excitement. Précisément, Watson. The alibis are too tight, like a suit tailored to deceive. Let us consider the red herrings. Grayson is one, dangled before us by circumstance. But there is another, I think, in the form of this note. He lifted the half-finished letter from the desk, its broken sentence. There is something you must know about. Glowing in the dim light.
Too smooth by half. And Mrs. Harrow, her talk of a shadow feels like a dodge. Holmes chuckled softly. You are learning, Hastings. But do not be swayed by the obvious. The shadow Mrs. Harrow mentioned. It is vague, yes, but it is a detail that does not fit the pattern of polite lies. And Miss Wentworth's observation of Langston's watchfulness? C'est une piste, a trail to follow. He crossed to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain to reveal a view obscured by fog. The shadow, he murmured, almost to himself. A figure outside, perhaps, or a trick of the light? The windows are locked, yet Mrs. Harrow's words linger. We must verify. Watson frowned. You think someone entered from outside? The ground's soft from the rain. There'd be footprints. Exactement, Holmes said, his voice sharp. And if there are none, the shadow becomes even more significant. Come, let us examine the exterior. The trio stepped into the chill, fog-laden air, circling the manor to the library's windows. The ground beneath was indeed soft, but the earth showed no signs of disturbance, no footprints, no scuffs, only the smooth blankets of fallen leaves. Holmes knelt, his fingers brushing the soil, then stood, his expression unreadable. No one entered here, he said. The shadow, then, was inside, or imagined. Back in the library, Holmes turned his attention to the sherry glass, lifting it carefully to the light. Watson, You said no poison, but the glass is half empty. Miss Margaret drank, yet her posture suggests she was standing when struck. The glass was placed, not dropped. A curious detail, no? Watson nodded, his brow furrowing. She was at ease then, trusted the killer enough to drink with them. Or, Holmes said, his eyes narrowing, the glass is another red herring, placed to suggest a narrative that does not exist. We must question further, but with care. The killer is watching, and they will not expect us to see through their misdirection. As the afternoon waned, Holmes instructed Hastings to observe the guests discreetly during dinner, noting their interactions, their glances, their silences. The truth, Hastings, he said, is in the little things, the gesture, the pause, the lie that betrays itself in a moment of carelessness. Watch, and we shall see who casts the next shadow. Hastings nodded, his resolve hardening. The manor, with its creaking floors and watchful portraits, seemed to close in around them, each room a potential trap, each guest a potential predator. And as Holmes returned to his silent contemplation, Hastings knew that the red herrings were only the beginning of a far deeper game. Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. The guests sat under the weight of suspicion, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of candelabras. Captain Arthur Hastings, seated between Miss Clara Wentworth and Dr. Julian Carver, followed Sherlock Holmes' directive to observe, his eyes catching the subtle interplay of glances and gestures among the company. Holmes himself was absent, having excused himself to continue his examination of the library, leaving Dr. Watson to represent their investigative presence at the table. Sir Reginald presided with a wary dignity, his attempts at civility unable to mask the strain in his voice. Lady Eleanor, seated to his right, picked at her food, her eyes darting to the empty chair where Holmes should have been. Mr. Victor Langston, ever the polished barrister, maintained a stream of light conversation, though his sharp gaze lingered on each guest as if cross-examining them. Mrs. Beatrice Harrow, shrouded in her mourning black, ate in silence, her hands steady, but her expression distant. Miss Wentworth, beside Hastings, offered occasional witty remarks, but her tone carried an edge, as though she were testing the waters of the room's unease. Dr. Carver, his spectacles glinting in the candlelight, seemed preoccupied, his fork pausing mid-air as if lost in thought. Hastings, mindful of Holmes's instructions, noted a peculiar detail during the second course. As the footman served the soup, a silver spoon slipped from Dr. Carver's hand, clattering to the floor. The doctor flushed, mumbling an apology, and retrieved it with a haste that seemed out of character for his usual precision. The incident was minor, yet it struck Hastings as significant, an inconsistency in the doctor's otherwise meticulous demeanor. He filed the observation away, resolving to share it with Holmes. After dinner, as the guests retired to the drawing room, Hastings slipped away to find Holmes in the library. The room was dimly lit, the chandelier casting long shadows across the shelves. Holmes stood by the desk, a magnifying glass in hand, examining a small object with intense focus. Dr. Watson was nearby, cataloguing the contents of the display case where the dagger had been kept. "Hastings, mon ami," Holmes said without looking up. "Your timing is impeccable. You have observed the guests. What have you seen?" Hastings recounted the dinner, emphasizing Dr. Carver's fumble with the spoon. "It was odd, Holmes. He's so precise, yet he dropped it like a nervous schoolboy, and he seemed distracted all evening, scribbling in that notebook of his." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A fine observation, Hastings. The little things, they betray the mind's disquiet. And now I have found a little thing of my own." He held up a small folded piece of paper, no larger than a calling card, its edges slightly worn. This was tucked beneath the blotter on the desk, overlooked by Lestrade's men. "It is not in Miss Margaret's hand, but it is illuminating. He unfolded the paper, revealing a brief handwritten note. "Meet me in the library at 7:30. We must resolve this tonight." The script was elegant, with a slight flourish, and unsigned. Holmes passed it to Watson, who frowned as he read it. "No signature," Watson said. "Could it be from one of the guests, or someone else in the household?" "Precisement," Holmes replied, his voice low. "The time, 7:30, is critical. It places the meeting just before the murder. Miss Margaret was in the library writing her own note to Sir Reginald when she was interrupted. This note suggests she was expecting someone she trusted enough to meet alone." Hastings felt a chill. "Then the killer lured her here, but who wrote it? The handwriting doesn't match hers." Holmes nodded, his fingers brushing his moustache. "We shall compare it to samples from the guests. But first, let us consider the sherry glass." He moved to the low table where the glass still stood, its amber contents undisturbed. "Watson, you confirm no poison, but observe the rim. There is a faint smudge, almost imperceptible, as if someone wiped it clean, but not entirely." Holmes lifted the glass to the light, his magnifying glass revealing a subtle residue near the lip. "Lipstick, perhaps," he murmured. "A trace of color, too faint for the naked eye. Miss Margaret wore none, which suggests another presence in the room, someone who drank from this glass, or handled it." Watson's brow furrowed. "Lady Eleanor and Miss Wentworth both wear lipstick, though it's subtle. Could it be one of them?" "Or neither," Holmes said, his tone sharp. "The smudge is a clue, but not a conclusion. We must also consider the book of sonnets, open to sonnet 18. Why that page? Was it chance or a message? The crease in the corner suggests it was handled deliberately, perhaps to mark the spot." Hastings glanced at the book, still lying near where Miss Margaret had fallen. "A romantic sonnet," he said. "Could it point to an affair? A motive rooted in passion?" Holmes's smile was enigmatic. "You are romantic, Hastings, but not entirely wrong. The sonnet speaks of beauty and permanence, yet it was left open by a dying hand. It is a contradiction, and contradictions are the breadcrumbs of truth." He turned to the fireplace, his gaze falling on the cold hearth. "And then there is Mrs. Harrow's shadow. She saw it past the drawing-room window, yet we found no footprints outside. The shadow, the lipstick, the note, these are threads in a tapestry of deception, but one thread stands out: the timing." Holmes crossed to the brass clock on the mantel, its hands now reading 9:15 p.m. "The clock is precise, yet it tells us something curious. The scream was heard at 8, but Miss Margaret was dead by then, according to Dr. Carver's estimate. The scream, then, was not hers." Hastings started. "Not hers? But who else could it have been?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with quiet intensity. "That, mon ami, is the question. The scream was a signal, perhaps, or a distraction. Someone wished to draw attention to the library at that precise moment. Why? To establish an alibi? Or to ensure the body was found?" Watson set down his notebook, his expression grave. "You're saying the killer orchestrated the discovery? That's devilishly clever." "Indeed," Holmes said, pacing slowly. "The killer is not merely clever but meticulous. They left clues to mislead. Grayson's proximity, the sherry glass, the open book. Yet they could not erase every trace. The smudged lipstick, the hidden note, the scream, these are their mistakes, and they will be their undoing." Holmes paused, his gaze distant. "We must now press the guests further, but with subtlety. The killer is among them, watching, calculating. Dr. Carver's fumble, Miss Wentworth's sharp eyes, Mrs. Harrow's shadow, each is a piece of the puzzle. Tomorrow I shall request handwriting samples and observe their reactions. For now, Hastings, continue to watch. The smallest gesture may betray the truth." As they left the library, locking the door behind them, Hastings felt the weight of the manor's secrets pressing closer. The fog outside seemed to seep into the very walls, blurring the line between truth and deception. Holmes, however, moved with the confidence of a man who saw through the mist. his mind already weaving the threads of the case into a pattern only he could discern. And as the clock ticked on, Hastings knew that the next clue would bring them one step closer to the heart of the mystery, or deeper into its shadows. Chapter 7. More Lies Surface. The fog that had enveloped Marwood Manor persisted into the following morning, lending an air of unreality to the ancient estate as though it was suspended in a dream of suspicion and secrets. The dining room where breakfast was served was a study in strained politeness, the clatter of porcelain and silver doing little to mask the undercurrent of unease among the guests. Captain Arthur Hastings, seated across from Miss Clara Wentworth, observed the company with a sharpened eye, his mind still turning over Sherlock Holmes's revelations from the previous evening. Holmes himself sat at the head of the table, his demeanor serene yet watchful, his fingers delicately poised around a teacup as he studied the guests with the precision of a chess master contemplating a critical move. Dr. John Watson, ever the steady presence, had taken up a position near the window, his notebook open as he recorded the morning's interactions. The guests, though outwardly composed, betrayed their disquiet in subtle ways. Sir Reginald's hand trembled slightly as he poured cream into his coffee. Lady Eleanor's gaze lingered too long on her brother, and Mr. Victor Langston's easy charm seemed stretched thin, his laughter maintained her poised air, but her eyes flicked toward Holmes with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Mrs. Beatrice Harrow, as ever, was a silent figure, her morning dress absorbing the light, her expression unreadable. Holmes, breaking the silence, set down his teacup with a deliberate clink. "Mes amis," he said, his voice smooth as velvet, "the tragedy of Miss Margaret's death has cast a shadow over this house, but shadows they reveal as much as they conceal. I have asked for handwriting samples from each of you to compare with a certain note found in the library. I trust you will comply, for the truth, it is like a mirror. It reflects only what is placed before it." A ripple of tension passed through the room. Lady Eleanor's fingers tightened on her napkin. Dr. Carver's spectacles slipped down his nose, and Langston's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Miss Wentworth raised an eyebrow, her tone light but pointed.
"A note, Mr. Holmes? How intriguing. And what does it say, if I may ask?"
Holmes's eyes gleamed. "It is a private matter, mademoiselle, but one that speaks to the heart of this mystery. A simple sample, a sentence or two, will suffice to clear the innocent." Sir Reginald cleared his throat, his voice strained. "Of course, Mr. Holmes. We have nothing to hide. I'll have paper and pens brought at once." As Grayson was summoned to fetch the materials, Hastings noted a subtle shift in the room's dynamics. Dr. Carver's scribbling ceased, his pen hovering over his notebook, as though reluctant to commit to the page. Mrs. Harrow's gaze lifted briefly, meeting Holmes's with a flicker of something. Fear, perhaps, or defiance. Langston leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming a silent rhythm on the tablecloth. The air was thick with unspoken questions, and Hastings felt the weight of secrets pressing closer. When the paper and pens arrived, Holmes instructed each guest to write a simple sentence. "I was in the drawing room at 8 o'clock." The task was completed in silence, the scratch of nibs on paper the only sound. Holmes collected the samples with a courteous nod, his eyes scanning each briefly before tucking them into his pocket. "Merci," he said. "These will be most illuminating." As the guests dispersed, Holmes beckoned Hastings and Watson to the library, where the morning light struggled through the fogged windows. He spread the handwriting samples on the desk, alongside the mysterious note found beneath the blotter. "Meet me in the library at 7:30. We must resolve this tonight." Holmes's magnifying glass hovered over the papers, his expression one of intense concentration. "Hastings? Watson?" he said, his voice low. "The note is our first, though less pronounced. It is close, but not identical. A deliberate alteration, perhaps, to disguise the hand." Watson frowned, peering over Holmes' shoulder. So Miss Wentworth wrote the note? Or someone mimicking her style? Holmes's smile was enigmatic. "Patience, Watson. The handwriting is a clue, but not the solution. Let us consider another thread, the financial motives that lurk beneath this polite gathering. Sir Reginald spoke of a family legacy. I suspect it is no mere sentiment, but a matter of considerable wealth." Hastings nodded, recalling Sir Reginald's vague explanation. He mentioned it briefly, but seemed reluctant to elaborate. Could Miss Margaret have known something about it? "Précisément," Holmes said, his eyes gleaming. "Her note to Sir Reginald, there is something you must know about, suggests she uncovered a secret tied to this legacy. Perhaps a will, a debt, or a hidden claimant. We must probe further." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the library door. Lady Eleanor entered, her face pale but composed, her hands clasped tightly before her. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I must speak with you, alone, if you please." Holmes raised an eyebrow but nodded, gesturing for Hastings and Watson to step outside. They retreated to the corridor, where Hastings paced, his mind racing. "What could she want, Watson? She's been so guarded." Watson's expression was grim. "She's frightened, Hastings. Something's eating at her, guilt, fear, or both." Minutes later, Holmes emerged, his face unreadable, but his eyes alight with purpose. "Lady Eleanor has shared a most intriguing revelation," he said, his voice low. "She claims that Miss Margaret confided in her 2 days ago about a letter she had found in Sir Reginald's study, a letter that hinted at a financial arrangement, one that could ruin the Marwood family if revealed. Margaret intended to confront Sir Reginald privately, but Lady Eleanor begged her to wait, fearing the consequences." Hastings' eyes widened. "A letter? Could it be tied to the legacies Sir Reginald mentioned?" Holmes nodded. "It is likely, but Lady Eleanor's confession raises questions. Why did she wait to speak? And why only now, when the handwriting samples were requested? She is either a victim of circumstance or a player in a deeper game." Watson rubbed his chin. "If there's a letter, we should search Sir Reginald's study. It might still be there." "Agreed," Holmes said, his tone sharp. "But we must tread carefully. The killer knows we are close, and they will act to protect their secret. Hastings, continue to observe the guests. Note their reactions to Lady Eleanor's absence. She may have betrayed..."
Had rested. The dagger, the note, the lipstick, the scream, and now this letter. The threads are weaving together, mes amis, but the pattern is not yet clear. We must find the letter before the killer does. The study, a smaller room lined with books and heavy with the scent of tobacco, was meticulously organized, yet Holmes's keen eyes quickly identified a locked drawer in Sir Reginald's desk. With a deft movement, he produced a small tool and opened it, revealing a bundle of papers. Among them was a letter, its seal broken, addressed to Sir Reginald in a bold, unfamiliar hand. Holmes scanned it, his expression darkening. "It speaks of a debt," he murmured. "Owed to a man named Charles Vane. A sum that could bankrupt the estate. Miss Margaret must have found this, and it cost her her life." As the fog pressed against the study's windows, Hastings felt the weight of the manor's secrets intensify. The letter was a new thread, but it led to a labyrinth of motives, greed, betrayal,
desperation. And somewhere among the guests, a killer waited, their lies unraveling with every step Holmes took toward the truth. The emotional turning point. The discovery of the letter in Sir Reginald's study cast a new shadow over Marwood Manor, its contents a silent accusation that seemed to pulse in the dim light of the afternoon. The fog outside had begun to lift, revealing the skeletal outlines of the ancient oaks, but within the manor the atmosphere grew heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in on the secrets they harbored. Captain Arthur Hastings, standing beside Sherlock Holmes in the study, felt the weight of the case pressing upon him, each clue a step closer to a truth that promised to be as devastating as it was inevitable. Holmes held the letter delicately, his magnifying glass tracing the bold, unfamiliar script. The words spoke of a debt to one Charles Vane, a sum so vast it threatened to topple the Marwood family's legacy. The letter was dated 3 months prior, its tone curt and demanding, with a veiled threat of exposure if the debt remained unpaid. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the quiet intensity of a man who saw not just the words, but the motives they concealed. "This letter, Hastings," he said, his voice low, "is the spark that ignited our tragedy. Miss Margaret found it, and her discovery sealed her fate. But who is Charles Vane? And why was this debt so dangerous that it led to murder?" Dr. John Watson, who had been examining the other papers in the drawer, looked up, his expression grave. Could Vane be one of the guests under a false name? Langston, perhaps? He's got the sharp, I suspect, is about to break. They returned to the drawing room, where the guests had gathered under the watchful eye of Inspector Lestrade's constable. The air was thick with tension, the polite facade of the previous days crumbling under the strain of suspicion. Sir Reginald stood by the fireplace, his face etched with exhaustion, while Lady Eleanor sat rigid, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Dr. Carver's notebook lay closed on the table, his spectacles pushed up onto his forehead as he stared into the distance. Miss Clara Wentworth maintained her air of composure, but her eyes flicked towards the door with a wariness that betrayed her calm. Mr. Victor Langston leaned against the mantel, his smile a brittle mask, while Mrs. Beatrice Harrow remained a silent spectre, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. Holmes entered with a quiet authority, his presence commanding attention. "Mes amis," he said, his voice smooth but edged with steel. "The truth is a delicate thing, easily obscured by lies, but it cannot hide forever. A letter has come to light, one that speaks of a debt that threatens the very foundation of this house. Miss Margaret knew of it, and for that knowledge she paid with her life. I ask you now, who among you knows of Charles Vane?" The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. Sir Reginald's face paled, his hand gripping the mantel for support. Lady Eleanor let out a small gasp, her eyes darting to her brother. Dr. Carver's spectacles slipped down his nose, and he fumbled to adjust them, his hands trembling. Miss Wentworth's expression remained impassive, but her fingers tightened on the arm of her chair. Langston's smile vanished, replaced by a hard, calculating look. Mrs. Harrow for the first time lifted her gaze, her eyes wide with something akin to recognition. It was Lady Eleanor who broke the silence, her voice trembling but resolute. "Mr. Holmes," she said, rising from her chair, "I cannot bear this any longer. I know of Charles Vane. He was a business associate of my late father, a man with whom Reginald dealt years ago. The debt, it was an old matter, one I thought resolved. But Margaret, she told me she found a letter,
and she feared it would ruin us. Sir Reginald turned sharply, his face a mask of anguish. "Eleanor, why did you not tell me? If Margaret knew, I could have—" "You could have what, Reginald?" Lady Eleanor's voice rose, her composure cracking. "Paid it? Hidden it? The debt is beyond our means. Margaret was going to tell you, but I begged her to wait. I thought I could find a way to protect us." The room fell silent, the weight of a confession settling over the guests like a shroud. Holmes's eyes gleamed, his mind clearly racing.
With tears.
2 days ago, in my room. She came to me after finding the letter in Reginald's study. She was loyal, Mr. Holmes. She wanted to protect the family, but she felt it was her duty to tell Reginald. I told her to wait until after the weekend, until we could speak privately. Holmes nodded, his fingers brushing his moustache. "And did you see her again after this conversation?" "No," Lady Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. Not until the scream." Hastings, watching from the corner, felt a pang of sympathy for Lady Eleanor, but his soldier's instincts warned him that her confession, though emotional, was incomplete. Holmes, too, seemed to sense this, his gaze shifting to the other guests. "A debt, a letter, a loyal housekeeper silenced," he said, pacing slowly. "But there is more, no? Who else knew of this letter? Who feared its exposure?" Dr. Carver cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. I heard Margaret mention something about a letter to Grayson the day before the gathering. I was in the hall fetching my bag. She sounded agitated, but I didn't think much of it at the time." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And you did not think to mention this before, Doctor? A curious omission." Carver flushed, his hands fumbling with his notebook. "It seemed trivial, Mr. Holmes. Servants' gossip, I thought. I had no idea it was connected to this." Langston's laugh cut through the tension, sharp and mocking. "Really, Doctor, you're as jumpy as a cat. If we're pointing fingers, perhaps we should ask Mrs. Harrow about her shadow. Sounds like a convenient story to divert attention." Mrs. Harrow's head snapped up, her eyes blazing with sudden fire. "How dare you, Mr. Langston? I saw what I saw, a shadow moving past the window. I am not the one weaving tales to hide my own guilt." The outburst startled the room, and even Holmes paused, his gaze fixed on Mrs. Harrow. "Madam," he said softly, "your shadow is a detail of great interest. Can you describe it further? Its shape, its movement?" Mrs. Harrow's hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "It was tall, indistinct, like a man's silhouette. It passed quickly, just before the scream. I thought it was nothing, but now I fear it was the killer." Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. "Merci, madame. Your candor is most valuable." He turned to the group, his voice rising slightly. "The letter, the debt, the shadow. These are the threads of a tapestry woven with care. But one of you has pulled too tightly, and the fabric is beginning to fray. I urge you to consider your secrets, for they will not remain hidden much longer." As the guests dispersed, their faces are the truth, Hastings, but not the whole. Her tears are genuine, but her timing is suspect, and Mrs. Harrow's shadow, it grows more intriguing. We must search her room and the drawing-room windows for further clues. The emotional cracks are widening, mon ami, and soon the truth will spill forth. As they left the drawing room, the manor seemed to pulse with hidden motives, each guest a shadow in the fog of deception. Holmes, undaunted, moved with the certainty of a man who saw the pattern emerging, and Hastings knew that the next revelation would bring them closer to unmasking the killer. Chapter 9. The Trap. The late afternoon sun pierced the thinning fog, casting long, slanted rays through the windows of Marwood Manor. Yet the air within remained heavy with suspicion. The emotional weight of Lady Eleanor's confession and Mrs. Harrow's outburst lingered, each word a crack in the facade of civility that had held the guests together. Sherlock Holmes, Captain Arthur Hastings, and Dr. John Watson stood in the study, the letter concerning Charles Vane's debt still on the desk, its stark words a silent accusation. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the quiet intensity of a predator closing in on its prey, his mind weaving the threads of the case into a net he was preparing to cast. "Hastings, Watson," Holmes said, his voice low and deliberate. "The time has come to tighten the screws. The killer is among us, watching, calculating, but they are not infallible. Lady Eleanor's revelation and Mrs. Harrow's shadow have stirred the waters, and now we must apply pressure to see what rises to the surface. Tonight we shall gather the guests and set a trap." Hastings felt a thrill of anticipation. "A trap, Holmes? You mean to provoke the killer into revealing themselves?" "Précisément," Holmes replied, his fingers brushing his moustache. "The killer believes they have woven a perfect web of deception, but every web has a weak point. We shall exploit it with a careful blend of truth and suggestion." Watson, ever practical, frowned. "What's the plan, Holmes? You can't just accuse someone outright, not without evidence." Holmes's smile was enigmatic. "Evidence, Watson, is in the details we have already uncovered. The note, the lipstick, the dagger, the scream. But the trap requires psychology, not merely facts. The killer is confident, but confidence breeds carelessness. We shall use their own secrets against them." Holmes instructed Hastings to summon the guests to the drawing room after dinner, ensuring that Inspector Lestrade and his constable were present to lend official weight to the proceedings. As the evening approached, the manor seemed to hum with tension, its corridors echoing with the soft tread of footsteps and the murmur of whispered conversations. Hastings, tasked with observing the guests during dinner, noted their strained interactions. Sir Reginald's forced geniality, Lady Eleanor's nervous glances, Dr. Carver's distracted silence, Miss Wentworth's sharp-edged wit, Mr. Langston's calculated charm, and Mrs. Harrow's continued withdrawal. Each seemed to carry a private burden, and Hastings wondered which of them would crack under Holmes's scrutiny. At 9 o'clock, the guests assembled in the drawing room, the fire casting flickering shadows across their faces. Inspector Lestrade stood by the door, his arms crossed, while the constable hovered nearby, notebook in hand. Holmes stood before the fireplace, his compact figure commanding the room with an air of quiet authority.
Guests sat in a semicircle, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and defiance.
"Mes amis," Holmes began, his voice smooth but edged with purpose. "The murder of Miss Margaret is a puzzle of many pieces, but tonight I shall begin to fit them together. Each of you has a role in this drama, and each of you holds a fragment of the truth. I propose to reconstruct the events of that fateful evening, and I invite you to correct me if I err." He paced slowly, his eyes scanning the group. At 7:30, Miss Margaret was in the library writing a note to Sir Reginald, a note that spoke of a secret she had uncovered, a letter, perhaps, concerning a debt to one Charles Vane. He paused, noting Sir Reginald's sharp intake of breath and Lady Eleanor's trembling hands. She was expecting someone, as evidenced by another note found beneath the blotter. "Meet me in the library at 7:30. We must resolve this tonight." Miss Wentworth's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Langston's smile was tight, almost predatory, while Dr. Carver adjusted his spectacles nervously. Mrs. Harrow's gaze remained fixed on the fire, her silence heavy. Holmes continued, his voice steady. "Miss Margaret trusted this person, for she drank sherry with them, leaving a smudge of lipstick on the glass, a detail that suggests a woman's presence, though not conclusively. The book of sonnets, open to sonnet 18, was left beside her, perhaps as a message, perhaps as a distraction. And then, at 8 o'clock, a scream pierced the manor, drawing you all to the library. But the scream, mes amis, was not Miss Margaret's. She was already dead, killed by a single thrust of an ornamental dagger. A murmur rippled through the room. Lady Eleanor's hand flew to her throat, and Dr. Carver's notebook slipped to the floor. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to Holmes. "The scream," Holmes said, his tone sharpening, "was a deliberate act, meant to establish alibis or divert attention. The killer struck swiftly, then ensured the body was found. But they left traces, the lipstick, the note, the shadow seen by Mrs. Harrow. And now I ask, who among you wrote that note, luring Miss Margaret to her death?" The room fell silent, the crackle of the fire the only sound. Holmes's gaze swept over the guests, lingering on each face. "Sir Reginald," he said, turning to the host, "you spoke of a family legacy. Was this debt to Charles Vane the secret Miss Margaret uncovered?" Sir Reginald's face flushed, his voice hoarse. I knew of the debt, Mr. Holmes. It was an old matter from my father's time. I thought it settled, but the letter, it resurfaced. Margaret must have found it, but I swear I did not know she intended to confront me."
"To protect the family. I feared the scandal would ruin us. I didn't want her dead, Mr. Holmes. I swear it." Holmes' expression remained impassive as he turned to Miss Wentworth. "Mademoiselle, your handwriting bears a striking resemblance to the note found in the library. Did you summon Miss Margaret to discuss this debt, or something more personal?" Miss Wentworth's smile was icy. "I wrote no such note, Mr. Holmes. If my handwriting resembles it, perhaps someone copied my style to cast suspicion. I suggest you look to Mr. Langston. He's skilled at manipulation, is he not?" Langston's laugh was sharp. "A fine deflection, Miss Wentworth. But I was in the smoking room, as I've said. If you're looking for secrets, ask Dr. Carver about his late-night wanderings." Dr. Carver started, his face paling. "I've told you I went to fetch my notebook. I had nothing to do with this." Holmes raised a hand, silencing the rising voices. "Enough. The truth is close, mes amis. It will not be denied. Mrs. Harrow, your shadow, describe it once more. Was it tall like a man or smaller like a woman?" Mrs. Harrow's voice was barely audible. "Tall, Mr. Holmes, like a man's silhouette, moving quickly past the window." Holmes nodded, his eyes gleaming. "A tall shadow, a smudged glass, a hidden note. The pieces are falling into place. I propose a small experiment. Tomorrow, I shall recreate the scene in the library with your assistance. The killer will not escape the light of truth." As the guests dispersed, their faces pale and shaken, Hastings leaned close to Holmes. "You're pushing them hard, Holmes. Do you know who it is?" Holmes' smile was faint but confident. "I have my suspicions, Hastings, but the trap is not yet sprung. The killer is clever, but they have made one fatal error. Tomorrow we shall expose it." As the manor settled into an uneasy silence, Hastings felt the tension coiling tighter. Holmes' trap was set, and the killer, whoever they were, was walking into it. The shadows of Marwood Manor were lengthening, but Holmes' method was a beacon, guiding them toward the truth. The morning sun broke through the remnants of the fog, bathing Marwood Manor in a pale golden light that seemed to mock the darkness within its walls. The drawing room, where Sherlock Holmes had summoned the guests for his promised reconstruction, was a stage set for revelation. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the faces of the assembled company, each of whom sat in tense anticipation. Captain Arthur Hastings stood near the door, his heart pounding with the certainty that this was the moment the truth would be laid bare. Dr. John Watson, notebook in hand, stood beside Inspector Lestrade, whose sceptical frown belied his curiosity. The guests, Sir Reginald Marwood, Lady Eleanor, Dr. Julian Carver, Miss Clara Wentworth, Mr. Victor Langston,
and Mrs. Beatrice Harrow sat in a semicircle, their expressions a gallery of fear, defiance, and resignation. Holmes stood before the fireplace, his compact figure radiating authority, his eyes gleaming with the quiet triumph of a mind that had unraveled the Gordian knot of the mystery. In his hand, he held the folded note, found beneath the library's blotter its cryptic message, "Meet me in the library at 7:30. We must resolve this tonight," a key to the puzzle he was about to solve. "Mes amis," Holmes began, his voice clear and resonant. "The murder of Miss Margaret was a crime of precision, cloaked in misdirection, but no crime is perfect. The killer, they believed they had accounted for every detail, but the little grey cells, they do not rest until every thread is woven into the tapestry of truth. Tonight, I shall reveal the killer, and I shall do so by reconstructing the events of that fatal evening, step by step." He paced slowly, his gaze sweeping over the guests. "Let us begin at 7 o'clock, when Miss Margaret was alive, performing her duties. She delivered sherry to the library, as Grayson confirmed, and there she remained, writing a note to Sir Reginald. There is something you must know about. A secret, perhaps, tied to the letter we found in Sir Reginald's study concerning a debt to Charles Vane. But another note, this one," he held up the folded paper, "lured her to the library at 7:30, where she met her killer." Sir Reginald shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. Lady Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap, while Dr. Carver's spectacles glinted as he adjusted them nervously. Miss Wentworth's eyes were sharp, calculating, and Langston's smile was a thin veneer over his tension. Mrs. Harrow remained still, her gaze fixed on Holmes. Holmes continued, his tone measured. Miss Margaret trusted her visitor, for she drank sherry with them, leaving a smudge of lipstick on the glass, a detail that suggests a woman's presence, though we shall return to that. The book of Shakespeare's sonnets, open to sonnet 18, was left beside her, perhaps as a message, perhaps as a distraction. At 7:45, she was stabbed with an ornamental dagger taken from the display case in the library. The wound was precise, fatal, and she died without a struggle, indicating she knew her killer. But the scream heard at 8 o'clock was not hers. She was already dead. A murmur rippled through the room. Lestrade's frown deepened, and Watson's pen paused over his notebook. Holmes raised a hand, silencing the whispers. The scream was a masterstroke, a distraction to draw you all to the library, ensuring the body was found and alibis established. Death threatened the Marwood family's legacy. Sir Reginald, you knew of it, yet claimed it was settled. Lady Eleanor, you begged Miss Margaret to delay her revelation, fearing ruin. But there is more. Miss Margaret's loyalty to the family was absolute, yet she uncovered a secret that someone could not allow to be exposed. Holmes paused, his gaze settling on Dr. Carver. Doctor, your nervous demeanor and frequent scribbling suggest a man with much on his mind. You overheard Miss Margaret speaking of a letter to Grayson. Did you know its contents? Carver's face flushed, his hands trembling. I told you, Mr. Holmes, it was idle gossip. I had no reason to harm her. Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable, and turned to Miss Wentworth. Mademoiselle, your handwriting bears a striking resemblance to the note luring Miss Margaret to the library. You are observant, calculating, qualities that serve a killer well. Miss Wentworth's smile was icy. A clever accusation, Mr. Holmes, but I wrote no such note. If someone mimicked my hand, perhaps you should ask Mr. Langston. He's adept at twisting truths. Langston's laugh was sharp. You flatter me, Miss Wentworth. But I was in the smoking room, as I've said. If you're looking for a killer, try Mrs. Harrow. Her shadow story is flimsy at best. Mrs. Harrow's eyes flashed with indignation. I saw what I saw, Mr. Langston, a tall shadow moving past the window just before the scream. Holmes's smile was faint but knowing. The shadow, madame, is the key. You described it as tall, like a man's silhouette, yet the windows were locked and no footprints marked the ground outside. The shadow was inside, a trick of light or a deliberate misdirection. And now, let us return to the lipstick. He produced the sherry glass, holding it to the light. The smudge is faint but distinct. Lady Eleanor, Miss Wentworth, you both wear lipstick, yet neither matches this shade precisely. But there is another possibility. His gaze shifted to Mrs. Harrow. Madame, you wear no lipstick now, but in your youth, perhaps, a trace of colour left to mislead us. Mrs. Harrow's face paled, her hands clutching her dress. I haven't worn lipstick in years, Mr. Holmes. I swear it. Holmes nodded, his eyes gleaming. Then let us consider the scream. It was not Miss Margaret's, for she was dead. Who screamed and why? I propose it was the killer, or an accomplice, ensuring the body was found. And now, the final piece, the dagger. He crossed to the display case, his fingers brushing the velvet cushion. The dagger was taken from here, a family heirloom known to all who frequented this library. But only one of you had the opportunity, the motive, and the knowledge to use it. Holmes turned sharply, snapped, rising from his chair. You have no proof, Holmes. Holmes's eyes were cold, unrelenting. You were in the smoking room alone at the critical time. The note, though disguised, bears traces of your legal script, subtle but unmistakable. The lipstick smudge was a deliberate plant taken from Miss Wentworth's belongings to cast suspicion. The shadow Mrs. Harrow saw was you passing the drawing-room window as you slipped back from the library, using the corridor's shadows to conceal your movements. And the scream, it was you, mimicking a woman's cry to draw attention and secure your alibi. Langston's face contorted with rage. This is nonsense. Why would I kill a housekeeper? Holmes stepped closer, his voice like steel. Because Miss Margaret discovered your true identity, Charles Vane. You are not merely a barrister, but the man to whom the Marwoods owed a ruinous debt. She found the letter, confronted you, and you silenced her to protect your claim. The sonnet, the sherry, the scream, all were your misdirection. But you could not erase every trace. Langston lunged forward, but Lestrade's constable seized him, pinning his arms. The room was a chaos of shouts and gasps, but Holmes remained calm, his gaze fixed on the struggling barrister. The little grey cells, Mr. Langston, they see what others miss. You are finished. As Langston was led away, cursing, the guests sat in stunned silence. Sir Reginald buried his face in his hands. Lady Eleanor wept softly, and Mrs. Harrow's eyes shone with relief. Holmes turned to Hastings and Watson, his expression serene. The tapestry is complete, mes amis. The truth, it always prevails. The manor seemed to exhale, its shadows lifting as the killer was unmasked. But Hastings knew that Holmes's work was not yet done, for there were still questions to answer, motives to unravel, and a legacy to mend. Chapter 11. The Reflection. The drawing-room of Marwood Manor, so recently a stage for accusation and revelation, now lay quiet, its air heavy with the aftermath of truth. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to embers, casting a soft, ruddy glow over the guests who remained, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Mr. Victor Langston, unmasked as both the murderer and the enigmatic Charles Vane, had been taken into custody by Inspector Lestrade and his constable, his protests echoing down the corridor until they faded into the manor's depths. Captain Arthur Hastings stood by the window, the late morning sun filtering through the last wisps of fog, his mind still reeling from Sherlock Holmes's masterful unveiling of the killer. Dr. John Watson, seated near the fire, scribbled notes with a steady hand, his expression one of quiet admiration for his friend's genius. Holmes himself stood apart, his compact figure silhouette.
Marwood, Lady Eleanor, Dr. Julian Carver, Miss Clara Wentworth, and Mrs. Beatrice Harrow sat in a subdued circle, their earlier tensions replaced by a fragile calm. The weight of the mystery's resolution hung over them, yet questions lingered, like shadows that refused to fully dissipate. Holmes broke the silence, his voice soft but resonant. "Mes amis, the truth has been uncovered, and the shadow over Marwood Manor has lifted. Yet, as is often the case, the truth leaves its own scars. I owe you an explanation, for the method of Sherlock Holmes is not merely to accuse, but to illuminate." Sir Reginald, his face haggard but composed, leaned forward. "Mr. Holmes, I am grateful beyond words, but I still struggle to understand. How did you know it was Langston? And this debt, how did it lead to such a tragedy?" Holmes' lips curved in a faint smile, his fingers brushing his moustache. "The debt, Sir Reginald, was the spark, but the fire was kindled by human nature, greed, fear, and deception. Let us retrace the steps, but clarity is the reward of order and method." He paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Miss Margaret, your loyal housekeeper, was a woman of duty. She discovered a letter in your study, one that revealed debt to Charles Vane, a debt so vast it threatened the Marwood legacy. She intended to inform you, as evidenced by her unfinished note. There is something you must know about. But another note, found beneath the library's blotter, lured her to her death. Meet me in the library at 7:30. We must resolve this tonight." This note, though disguised, bore traces of Mr. Langston's legal script, a detail I confirmed with the handwriting samples. Lady Eleanor, her eyes still red from tears, spoke softly. "But why would Langston Vane kill her? Surely he could have negotiated the debt." Holmes nodded, his gaze softening. "A fair question, madame. Langston, as Charles Vane, was not merely a creditor but a man with a vendetta. The debt was an old wound tied to your father's dealings, and Langston saw it as a means to reclaim power over the Marwood family. Miss Margaret's discovery threatened to expose him before he could press his claim. He lured her to the library, where she trusted him enough to share a glass of sherry, a glass he later smudged with lipstick, stolen from Miss Wentworth's belongings, to cast suspicion elsewhere." Miss Wentworth's eyes narrowed, her voice sharp. "A clever trick, Mr. Holmes. But how did you know the lipstick wasn't mine?" Holmes' smile was wry. "The shade, mademoiselle, was too bold for your subtle taste, and too old-fashioned for Lady Eleanor's elegance. It was a relic, likely taken from a forgotten drawer in the manor, used to mislead. Langston was meticulous, but not infallible." Dr. Carver, his spectacles now steady, cleared his throat. "And the scream? You said it wasn't Margaret's. How could Langston mimic a woman's cry?" Holmes turned to him, his expression one of quiet triumph. "A barrister, Doctor, is a master of performance. Langston's voice, trained in the courts, could produce a convincing cry, high and piercing, to draw you all to the library. The timing, 8 o'clock, ensured his alibi, for he claimed to be in the smoking room, returning just as the scream was heard. But Mrs. Harrow's shadow betrayed him." Mrs. Harrow, her voice barely above a whisper, looked up. "The shadow? It was him, then?" "Oui, madame," Holmes said gently. "You saw him pass the drawing-room window, moving swiftly through the corridor to rejoin the group. The windows were locked, the ground outside unmarked. No one entered from without. The shadow was inside, a fleeting glimpse of the killer's haste." Hastings, unable to contain his curiosity, spoke up. "But the sonnet, Holmes! Sonnet 18! Why was it left open?" Was it a message? Holmes's eyes gleamed. A distraction, Hastings, but one with meaning. Langston chose it deliberately, perhaps to suggest a romantic motive, or to mock Miss Margaret's loyalty to the Marwoods, a beauty that would not fade, unlike their fortune. It was his arrogance, his need to gloat, that left such a clue. Watson closed his notebook, his voice thoughtful. It's a devilish plan, Holmes. He nearly got away with it. Indeed, Watson, Holmes replied. But the little grey cells, they do not sleep. The lipstick, the note, the shadow, the scream, these were his errors, small but fatal. The truth, it is like a mirror. It reflects even the tiniest flaw. Sir Reginald rose, his voice heavy with gratitude. Mr. Holmes, you have saved my family from ruin, though the cost has been great. Margaret was dear to us, and her loss, it will linger. Holmes inclined his head, his expression softening. The loss of a loyal heart is a wound that time alone can heal. But know this, Sir Reginald. Miss Margaret's loyalty was her strength, and it was that strength that led us to the truth. She did not die in vain. As the guests murmured their thanks, Holmes turned to Hastings and Watson, his voice low. Come, mes amis. Our work here is done. The manor will heal, but London calls, and there are other puzzles awaiting the method of Sherlock Holmes. They left the drawing-room, the guests' voices fading behind them. As they stepped into the hall, Hastings glanced back, seeing Sir Reginald and Lady Eleanor embrace, their faces a mixture of grief and relief. The manor, once a labyrinth of shadows, now felt lighter, as though the truth had cleansed its ancient wall. Into the waiting hansom cab, Watson and Hastings following. As the carriage rattled toward the station, Hastings felt a quiet satisfaction. The case was closed, the killer unmasked. But Holmes' words lingered, a reminder that some shadows, those of the heart, would always remain. Chapter 12. The Unraveling Threads. The departure of Sherlock Holmes, Captain Arthur Hastings, and Dr. John Watson from Marwood Manor was delayed by a sudden request from Sir Reginald, who, in the wake of the previous day's dramatic revelation, sought a final audience with the detective. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the Kentish countryside in hues of amber and gold. But within the manor, the atmosphere remained heavy with the residue of betrayal. The drawing-room, where the guests had reconvened at Sir Reginald's insistence, was a quieter place now. The absence of Mr. Victor Langston, now revealed as Charles Vane, and confined to the local galio, leaving a palpable void. Yet, as Hastings observed the remaining company, he sensed that the case, though resolved in its central mystery, had left threads dangling, questions unanswered, and secrets yet to be fully laid bare. Holmes stood before the fireplace, his posture as erect as ever, his eyes scanning the faces of Sir Reginald, Lady Eleanor, Dr. Julian Carver, Miss Clara Wentworth, and Mrs. Beatrice Harrow. Inspector Lestrade had returned to the village to oversee Langston's processing, leaving a single constable to guard the manor's entrance. Watson, seated near Hastings, held his notebook, his pen poised, as if expecting further revelations. The guests, though relieved by the unmasking of the killer, wore expressions of unease, as though the resolution had stirred other, deeper fears. "Mr. Holmes," Sir Reginald began, his voice weary but resolute, "your brilliance has saved my family from ruin and brought justice to poor Margaret. Yet, I cannot shake the feeling that there is more to this affair. The debt to Charles Vane. How did it come to this? And are there other secrets we should fear?" Holmes' eyes gleamed with a quiet intensity, his fingers steepled before him. "Sir Reginald, Your instinct is correct. The murder of Miss Margaret was the climax of a drama, but its roots run deep. The debt to Charles Vane, or rather Victor Langston, was not merely a financial matter, but a web of vengeance and ambition. Allow me to unravel the remaining threads, for the truth, it is never content with half measures. He paced slowly, his voice measured and precise. Let us return to the letter found in your study, Sir Reginald. A letter demanding repayment of a debt contracted by your late father. Langston, as Vane, believed this debt gave him leverage over your family, a means to reclaim.
Whose hands trembled slightly as she clutched her shawl. Madame, you spoke of Charles Vane as a business associate of your father, but there is more, is there not? Vane was no mere associate, he was a partner, wronged in a deal that left him destitute while your father prospered. Is this not so? Lady Eleanor's eyes widened, her voice barely audible. I knew only what father told me, Mr. Holmes. He said Vane was a reckless man, ruined by his own ambition. I never knew the details, only that the matter was settled long ago. Holmes nodded, his gaze softening but unrelenting. Settled, perhaps, in your father's mind, but not in Vane's. He rebuilt himself as Victor Langston, a barrister of repute, and insinuated himself into your circle, waiting for the moment to strike. Miss Margaret, with her keen eye and loyalty to your family, discovered his true identity through the letter. She intended to warn you, Sir Reginald, but Langston learned of her discovery and acted to silence her. Dr. Carver, his spectacles glinting in the firelight, cleared his throat. But how did Margaret find the letter? It was locked in Sir Reginald's study. Holmes's smile was faint but knowing. A housekeeper, Doctor, sees all. Miss Margaret, in her duties, had access to every room, every drawer. She was meticulous, and when she found the letter, she recognized its significance. Perhaps she overheard a conversation, or perhaps she saw Langston's reaction to a mention of Vane's name. Her note to Sir Reginald was her attempt to protect the family, but it cost her her life. Miss Wentworth, her composure regained, leaned forward, her eyes sharp. And the other clues, the lipstick, the sonnet, the shadow, were they all Langston's doing? Or is there more we don't know? Holmes's gaze met hers, a spark of admiration in his eyes. Mademoiselle, you are perceptive. The lipstick was indeed Langston's misdirection, stolen from your belongings to cast suspicion. The sonnet, a cruel jest, was chosen to suggest a romantic motive, perhaps to implicate you or Lady Eleanor. The shadow, seen by Mrs. Harrow, was Langston himself, moving through the corridor to rejoin the group after the murder. But there is one detail that remains, a small matter but significant. He turned to Mrs. Harrow, whose silent presence had grown more pronounced in the wake of the revelation. Madame, your shadow was the key, but your silence has been equally telling. You knew more than you admitted, did you not? You recognized Langston's silhouette because you had seen him before, perhaps in a moment of indiscretion. Mrs. Harrow's face paled, her hands clutching her mourning dress. I don't know what you mean, Mr. Holmes. Holmes's voice was gentle but firm. You saw him, madame, not just on the night of the murder, but earlier, perhaps in London, where Langston, as Vane, sought to ingratiate himself with the Marwoods. You were in. Mourning, yes, but not so isolated that you did not notice his interest in the family. Did you suspect his true identity? Mrs. Harrow's eyes filled with tears, her voice breaking. I met him once, years ago, when my husband was alive. He called himself Vane then. I thought nothing of it until I saw him here, and then the shadow, it reminded me. But I was afraid to speak, Mr. Holmes. I thought no one would believe me. Holmes nodded, his expression one of quiet sympathy. Your fear was understandable, madame, but your observation was invaluable. It confirmed Langston's movements and his identity. You have helped bring justice to Miss Margaret.
Watson closed his notebook, his voice thoughtful. So Langston planned this for years, biding his time until he could strike. It's a chilling thought, Holmes. Indeed, Watson, Holmes replied, his gaze distant. The human heart. It is a labyrinth of ambition and revenge. Langston's was consumed by both, and it led him to his ruin. Sir Reginald rose, his face etched with gratitude and sorrow. Mr. Holmes, you have done more than solve a murder. You have preserved our family's honor, though at a terrible cost. Margaret's loyalty will not be forgotten. Holmes inclined his head, his voice soft. Her loyalty was her strength, Sir Reginald, and it is fitting that it should be her legacy. My work here is done, but I leave you with this. Guard your secrets well, for they are the seeds of future tragedies. As the guests murmured their thanks, Holmes turned to Hastings and Watson. Come, mes amis. The train to London awaits, and there are other mysteries to unravel. The world, it does not pause for our triumphs. They stepped into the hall, the manor's ancient walls seeming to sigh in relief. Hastings glanced back, seeing the guests begin to disperse, their faces a mixture of gratitude and introspection. The case had ended, but its echoes would linger in Marwood Manor, a reminder of the fragility of trust and the power of truth. As the hansom cab carried them toward the station, Holmes sat in silence, his mind already turning to the next challenge, while Hastings felt a quiet pride in having witnessed the genius of Sherlock Holmes at work. Chapter 13. The Hidden Motive. The hansom cab rattled along the gravel drive of Marwood Manor, carrying Sherlock Holmes, Captain Arthur Hastings, and Dr. John Watson toward the village station, where the London train awaited. The sun, now high in the sky, bathed the Kentish countryside in a warm glow, but the manor's silhouette
Layers of dust. Holmes, as if sensing Hastings' thoughts, broke the silence, his voice low and thoughtful. "You are troubled, mon ami," he said, his eyes fixed on the passing landscape. "The case is closed, yet you feel the tapestry is incomplete. Is it not so?" Hastings nodded, his brow furrowing. "You've caught the killer, Holmes, and brilliantly. But I can't help wondering, why did Langston wait so long to act? If he was Charles Vane, nursing a grudge against the Marwoods for years, why choose this moment to strike? And what of the other guests? They all seem to carry their own secrets." Watson, ever practical, set down his notebook. "He's right, Holmes. Lady Eleanor's fear, Dr. Carver's nervousness, Mrs. Harrow's silence. There's more to this than just Langston's vendetta. Could there be another layer to the motive?" Holmes' lips curved in a faint smile, his fingers steepled before him. "You both have the instinct of the detective, though, not yet the method. The case of Miss Margaret's murder is solved, but the human heart, it is a labyrinth that yields its secrets slowly. Let us return, in thought, to Marwood Manor, for there is one thread yet to be pulled, a hidden motive that ties the guests together and explains why Langston chose this moment to act." The cab slowed as they approached the station, but Holmes' mind was clearly back in the manor's drawing room, reconstructing the web of relationships and secrets. "Consider the timing," he said. Langston, as Vane, had waited years to reclaim his due, yet he chose this weekend, this gathering, to strike. Why? Because the gathering was not merely a social affair, as Sir Reginald claimed, but a meeting to discuss the Marwood legacy,
a legacy tied to the debt that threatened their ruin. Hastings leaned forward. His interest piqued. "You mean the family matter?" Sir Reginald mentioned. He was vague about it, but you think it was more than just the debt. "Precisement," Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming. "The debt to Charles Vane was the spark, but the legacy was the fuel." Sir Reginald had summoned this group not only for camaraderie, but to address a crisis. The letter Miss Margaret found was a catalyst, but there was another secret, one that Langston feared would be exposed during this gathering. A secret that made his identity as Vane vulnerable. Watson's brow furrowed. Another secret? What could it be? The letter was damning enough. Holmes' gaze grew distant, as though seeing the manor's walls through the cab's window. The letter spoke of a debt, but it hinted at a deeper betrayal. Langston, as Vane, was not merely a credit
Destitute. Langston rebuilt his life as a barrister, but his resentment festered, and when he learned of this gathering, he saw his chance to act. Hastings' eyes widened. So, Miss Margaret's discovery of the letter wasn't just about the debt. It threatened to expose Langston's true identity and his claim to the estate.
Holmes nodded. Exactement. But there is more. The other guests, they were not mere bystanders. Each had a connection to the Marwood legacy, a reason to be at this gathering. Lady Eleanor, as Sir Reginald's sister, stood to lose her inheritance if the debt were called in. Dr. Carver, with his medical practice, may have been consulted on matters of health tied to the estate's future. Miss Wentworth, an heiress with ties to the East Indies, may have been courted as a potential investor to save the Marwoods from ruin. And Mrs. Harrow, her silence suggests a deeper knowledge, perhaps of Vane's past dealings with her late husband. Watson rubbed his chin, his voice thoughtful. So Langston killed Margaret to keep his identity hidden, but the gathering itself was a powder keg. Everyone had something at stake. Holmes's smile was faint but approving. You see the pattern, Watson. The gathering was a collision of motives and Langston exploited it. He lured Miss Margaret to the library using a note that mimicked Miss Wentworth's hand to cast suspicion. The lipstick smudge stolen from her belongings was another misdirection. The scream, his own creation, ensured the body was found, securing his alibi. But the shadow Mrs. Harrow saw, that was his fatal error, for it placed him in the corridor at the critical moment. Hastings shook his head, marveling at the intricacy. It's diabolical, Holmes, but how did you know it was Langston beyond the handwriting and the shadow? Holmes's eyes sparkled with quiet triumph. The little grey cells, Hastings. They see what others miss. Langston's demeanour, his calculated charm, his watchfulness betrayed a man playing a role. His alibi, too perfect, was a lie that crumbled under scrutiny. The sonnet, open to Sonnet 18, was his arrogance, a taunt to those who might suspect him. And Mrs. Harrow's shadow, though vague, was the final piece, a tall silhouette moving with purpose that could only be his. The cab reached the station, and the trio disembarked, the platform bustling with travellers bound for London. As they waited for the train, Holmes turned to Hastings, his voice soft but resolute. The motive, mon ami, is always the heart of the crime. Langston's was revenge, cloaked in greed. But the guests, too, have their motives: fear, loyalty, ambition. They are not guilty of murder, but they are not innocent of secrets. Watson closed his notebook, his expression one of quiet reflection. It's a sad business, Holmes. The Marwoods will
Fixed on the horizon.
The human heart, Watson, is a fragile thing. It seeks justice, but it also seeks forgiveness. The Marwoods will heal, but they must first face their own shadows. As the train whistle sounded, Hastings felt a sense of closure. yet the case's echoes lingered. The hidden motive, Langston's vendetta, the Marwood legacy, the secrets of the guests had been laid bare, but the cost was a reminder of the fragility of trust. Holmes, ever the enigma, boarded the train with a quiet nod, his mind already turning to the next mystery, while Hastings and Watson followed, bound for London and the promise of new challenges. Chapter 14. The Final Pieces. The train to London rattled through the Kentish countryside, its rhythm a steady counterpoint to the quiet introspection of Sherlock Holmes, Captain Arthur Hastings, and Dr. John Watson. The golden hues of late afternoon bathed the rolling fields, but within the carriage, the atmosphere was one of reflection, the weight of Marwood Manor's tragedy still clinging to the trio. Hastings, seated by the window, watched the landscape blur past, his mind turning over the intricacies of the case. The unmasking of Victor Langston as Charles Vane had resolved the murder of Miss Margaret, but the deeper currents of motive and consequence lingered, like ripples spreading across a still pond. Holmes, his compact figure relaxed yet alert, broke the silence, his voice soft but precise. "You are pensive, Hastings," he said, his eyes glinting with understanding. "The case is closed, yet you sense there are pieces yet to be placed. Tell me, what troubles you?" Hastings shifted, his brow furrowing. "It's the guests, Holmes. Langston was the killer, yes. But the others? Lady Eleanor, Dr. Carver, Miss Wentworth, Mrs. Harrow, they all seem to carry burdens beyond the murder. Were they merely bystanders, or did they play a role in the events that led to Margaret's death?" Watson, closing his notebook with a thoughtful nod, added, "He's right, Holmes. The Marwood legacy, the debt to Vane, it feels like there's more to their stories. Did Langston act alone, or was there complicity, even if unintentional?" Holmes's lips curved in a faint, approving smile. "You both see the shadows beneath the surface, and that is good. The little grey cells. They do not rest until every detail is accounted for. Let us then place the final pieces of this puzzle. For the truth, it is not complete until all its facets are illuminated." He leaned back, his fingers steepled, his gaze distant as though reconstructing the manor in his mind.
The state's future, prompted by the letter's reappearance. This, I believe, is why Langston chose this moment to act. Hastings leaned forward, his interest piqued. "You mean the gathering was about more than just the debt? Was there a plan to sell the estate? Or perhaps redistribute its assets?" Holmes nodded, his eyes gleaming. "Précisément, Hastings. The Marwood estate, though grand, is burdened by debts older than the one to Vane. Sir Reginald, I suspect, invited this group to discuss a potential sale or partnership to save the family from ruin. Miss Wentworth, with her wealth from the East Indies, was a likely candidate to invest. Dr. Carver, with his medical expertise, may have been consulted on Sir Reginald's health, which could affect the estate's succession. Mrs. Harrow, though in mourning, may have been a link to past dealings, her late husband perhaps involved in the original agreement with Vane." Watson's brow furrowed. "And Lady Eleanor? She seemed terrified of the debt's exposure. Was she protecting her brother, or something more?" Holmes's expression grew solemn. "Lady Eleanor's fear was genuine, Watson, but it was not only for her brother. She knew of the family's precarious finances, and her plea to Miss Margaret to delay her revelation was an attempt to buy time. She feared not just scandal, but the loss of her own position, her home, her status. Yet she did not kill, nor did she conspire.
Her silence was born of loyalty, not guilt. Hastings shook his head, marveling at the complexity. Sir Langston saw the gathering as his chance to silence Margaret and secure his claim. But what of Mrs. Harrow's silence? She recognized Vane, yet said nothing until pressed. Holmes's smile was faint but knowing. Mrs. Harrow, mon amie, is a woman of deep sorrow, but also of keen observation. Her silence was not complicity, but fear, of being disbelieved, of stirring old wounds tied to her husband's dealings with Vane. When she saw the shadow, it triggered a memory, but her mourning made her reluctant to speak. Her testimony, though late, was the key to confirming Langston's movements. Watson rubbed his chin, his voice thoughtful. And Dr. Carver? His nervousness, his notebook, were they just quirks or something more? Holmes chuckled softly. The good doctor is a man of science, but not of steel. His nervousness was the result of his own suspicions. He overheard Margaret's conversation with Grayson about the letter, and he feared being drawn into a scandal. His notebook was his refuge, a place to record his thoughts without committing to action. He is innocent, but not without his own small secrets. Hastings leaned back, his mind racing. And Miss Wentworth? Her sharpness, her watchfulness, could she have known perhaps because of his interest in the Marwood estate? But she had no proof. Her handwriting, mimicked in the note, was Langston's attempt to implicate her, but her composure never wavered. She is no killer, but she is a player in the game of wealth and power. The train whistle sounded, signaling their approach to London. Holmes's gaze returned to the window, his voice soft but resolute. The final pieces, mes amis, are these. The murder was Langston's alone. But the gathering amplified his desperation. Each guest, with their own motives, fear, loyalty, ambition, created the perfect storm for his crime. Miss Margaret's death was the price of their secrets, but it was also the catalyst for their salvation, for it brought the truth to light. Hastings felt a quiet awe at Holmes's clarity, the way he wove disparate threads into a cohesive whole. It's remarkable, Holmes. You saw through the chaos to the heart of it all. Holmes's smile was modest, almost wistful. The heart, Hastings, is both the puzzle and the solution. We solve the crime, but the human heart, it remains a mystery, even to Sherlock Holmes. As the train pulled into the station, the bustle of London enveloped them, a stark contrast to the somber quiet of Marwood Manor. Hastings and Watson followed Holmes onto the platform, their minds still turning over the case's complexities. The final pieces had been placed, the motive laid bare, but the echoes of the manor's tragedy would linger, a reminder of the delicate balance between truth and trust. Holmes paused, adjusting his hat against the city's clamour. Come, mes amis, he said, his voice brightening. London awaits, and with it, new challenges for the little grey cells. As they stepped into the crowd, Hastings felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that wherever Holmes led, the pursuit of truth would follow, illuminating even the darkest shadows. Chapter 15. The Quiet Exit. The clamour of London's bustling streets greeted Sherlock Holmes, Captain Arthur Hastings, and Dr. John Watson as they stepped from the train onto the platform of Victoria Station. The city's pulse, vibrant and relentless, was a stark contrast to the sombre stillness of Marwood Manor, where the echoes of Miss Margaret's murder still lingered in their minds. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones, and as the trio made their way toward a waiting hansom cab, Hastings felt the weight of the case settle into a quiet resolution, though its lessons remained vivid. Holmes, his compact figure moving with purpose, seemed already to be turning his thoughts to new horizons, his eyes gleaming with the restless energy of a mind ever hungry for the next puzzle. As they settled into the cab, the clatter of who
Final piece we've overlooked. Not of the crime, but of its impact. What becomes of the manor now, and those left behind?
Watson, his notebook tucked away, nodded in agreement. He's right, Holmes. The Marwoods have their justice, but the debt, the secrets, they'll haunt that family for years. And the other guests, what of them? Holmes's lips curved in a faint, reflective smile, his fingers brushing his mustache as he gazed out of the passing throng. You are both correct, mes amis. A crime, once solved, does not erase its ripples. The murder of Miss Margaret was a wound, but the healing of Marwood Manor depends on those who remain. Let us consider one last time the tapestry we've woven and the threads that linger. He leaned back, his voice soft but resonant, as though speaking to the city itself. Sir Reginald, he is a man of duty, but also of pride. The debt to Charles Vane, though exposed, will force him to confront the fragility of his family's legacy. He will sell portions of the estate perhaps, or seek Miss Wentworth's investment to stabilize their fortunes. His heart is heavy with the loss of Margaret, but her loyalty will inspire him to rebuild, to honor her memory by protecting what remains. Hastings nodded, picturing Sir Reginald's weary but resolute face. And Lady Eleanor? Her fear of scandal nearly broke her, but she stood by her brother. Holmes' eyes gleamed with quiet approval. Lady Eleanor, she is stronger than she appears. Her silence was born of loyalty, not weakness, and her confession, though belated, was a step towards redemption. She will support her brother, perhaps finding new purpose in mending the family's wounds. The shadow of the debt will linger, but she will not let it define her. Watson's brow furrowed, his voice thoughtful. What of Dr. Carver and Miss Wentworth? They seemed peripheral, yet caught in the web all the same. Holmes chuckled softly, a rare warmth in his tone. Dr. Carver, with his nervous scribbles and cautious demeanor, is a man of intellect, but not of courage. He will return to his practice, shaken but wiser, his notebook filled with lessons on the dangers of overhearing secrets. This Wentworth, however, is a force. Her wealth and ambition make her a player in the game of power. She may yet invest in the Marwood estate, not out of charity, but to secure influence. Her sharp mind will carry her far. But she will not forget the lesson of Langston's betrayal. Hastings glanced at Holmes, his curiosity piqued. And Mrs. Harrow? Her silence, her shadow, she was the key, yet she seemed so removed from it all. Holmes' expression softened, a rare flicker of empathy crossing his features. Mrs. Harrow, mon ami, is a soul adrift in grief. Her recognition of Vane, her hesitation to speak, was born
Return to her quiet life. But her courage in speaking, however late, has freed her from some of that burden. She will carry Marwood's tragedy, but it will not define her. The cab slowed as they approached Baker Street, the familiar sight of 221B rising like a beacon through the city's haze. Holmes' voice grew quieter, almost philosophical. The crime, it is solved, but the human heart, it remains a mystery. Each guest at Marwood Manor played a role, not in the murder, but in the drama that surrounded it. Their secrets, their fears, their ambitions, they created the stage on which Langston acted. Yet it was Miss Margaret's loyalty, her quiet strength, that brought the truth to light. Hastings felt a pang of admiration for the housekeeper, whose unassuming presence had been the linchpin of the case. She was the heart of the manor, wasn't she? Even in death, she protected them. Holmes nodded, his gaze distant. Précisément, Hastings. Loyalty, it is a rare and precious thing.
It cannot prevent tragedy, but it can illuminate the path to justice. Miss Margaret's death was a loss, but her legacy is the truth we uncovered. The cab came to a stop before 221B, and the trio disembarked, the familiar door beckoning them into the warmth of their sanctuary. As they climbed the stairs, Watson spoke, his voice tinged with wonder. "You saw it all, Holmes. The lipstick, the note, the shadow, the scream. How do you do it, time and again?" Holmes paused at the threshold, his hand on the doorknob, a faint smile playing on his lips. "The little grey cells, Watson. They see what others overlook, the small inconsistencies, the hidden truths. But it is not enough to see. One must act with order and method to bring light to the darkness." He opened the door, and the familiar scent of tobacco and books enveloped them. Mrs. Hudson, ever vigilant, greeted them with a tray of tea, her face brightening at their return. "Mr. Holmes, Captain Hastings, Dr. Watson, back at last. I trust you've solved another mystery?" Holmes inclined his head, his expression serene. "A mystery, Mrs. Hudson, and a lesson. The world, it is full of shadows, but the truth, it always finds a way." As they settled into their armchairs, the fire crackling in the grate, Hastings felt a sense of closure. The case of Marwood Manor was complete, its secrets laid bare, its justice served. Yet Holmes' words lingered, a reminder that the pursuit of truth was a journey without end. The detective's quiet exit from the manor had been the final act, but here, in the heart of London, new shadows awaited, and Sherlock Holmes would be ready to meet them.